I mean, thanks everyone for making your presentations. There's probably a whole host of kind of issues that one can sort of bring to the table. I thought maybe a way to kind of open up and unpack maybe some of the things that you guys are sort of pointing to is to look at this word culture that is part of the session when we talk about design computation and you know we usually foreground subjects of system engineering, the technical, the tool building, and the communication that that somehow enables. But it seems in the presentations that all of you are making, if that's coming via BIM or if that's almost like world building narrative fantasy, or if that's, in terms of using art almost in a counterculture kind of way to think about social political dimensions and some of the implications that that has when we're talking about the digital and how all of these things are somehow legible with a kind of footprint. I'm just quite curious in terms of how you interpret that relative to the word culture, because I feel like all the attempts are somehow trying to create the opportunity to bring people together and, in some sense, engage in ways that are instrumentalizing, I think, other forms of practice, from children game strategies to uh, really looking at everyday tools now that are embedded in a camera, scanning technologies, other things, and making that kind of accessible to people. I don't know what your thoughts are in terms of what contemporary culture is influencing your practice, but I think it would be of interest maybe to examine the word culture and your interpretations of that, if that's a good starting point, maybe. I don't know if maybe Jessica, if you would want to start, because it seemed more striking that this world of fantasy and narrative is very directly engaged in the way that you see a form of education, in professional practice.
Sure. I think there's a lot of different ways in which I see everyday culture is then maybe impacting how we approach these challenges that we're facing in the way that we've all discussed, making more accessible using art. I think there's this idea that people are multifaceted. We all have, everybody, like people have lives outside of work. They have different hobbies that they like to do. They don't necessarily stay in one career their whole or one job their whole career. They do different things. I think we're starting to really treat everybody who's in front of us as a multi-layered individual. And so bringing that back into engineering, we don't just have to think about engineering or technology in the same way we've always thought about it. We don't have to silo ourselves off. We can take a more holistic view because we're taking a more holistic view of people in our culture, and we can apply that to taking a more holistic view of how we approach things in our engineering. I think there's also this aspect of everything's on an app, everything is on social media, everything has to be very attention grabbing. There's all these TikTok channels that are making all these. I don't have TikTok. I'd like to precursor that disclaimer. I don't have TikTok, but as I understand, the kids on TikTok use it, these short videos to make things accessible, to make it digestible. And so as more young people come into our profession, and that's the way they're used to ingesting information, or that's the way that they connect with information, we have to adapt to that. And if we want people to engage with our work, our technical work, we have to find ways to make it more digestible, make it and look at these great things that are being produced, that is how people consume their content and their information. It's kind of a jumble. That's all the different thoughts I have together on that, of how culture is impacting how we do this. I think it's either a case of we catch up or we get left behind. And we're all agreeing that we can't be left behind. So we're having to think of new innovative ways to engage with people and to have those connections, and connections with the arts, connections with storytelling, this kind of thing.
Yeah, I guess where I was going with that question, maybe leading off with yourselves, is the fact that it is true in a generic sense, you know, all of the different forms of mediation and making things accessible. It seemed what was implied by some of the ways that you're working with people within the industry, with engineers themselves, is somehow trying to tease out a form of play, like a serious form of play, as a way to maybe engage engineering beyond the technical. And I mean, if I see some kind of synthesis, it's really just in the sense that you're trying to, you know, in a different way from, let's say, Angelica's and Victor's presentation, strategize and structure a way of engaging questions within these disciplines. And the novelty of play and narrative and the scene, almost of the fantasy scene, I think are ways that are really, in some sense, unorthodox. And the short form nature of a workshop is obviously very different than structuring a program like in Angelica's point of view. But it seems to me that education is very important, and the ways that we're sort of trying to engage that seem to be the way that you guys are dealing with how you're synthesizing culture at the moment, and also maybe some of the kinds of questions that are not a part of the way that people are sort of working within a much more practice-based and technical domain. So, I mean, it seems to me like you have an interest in fantasy, and fantasy became a tool, and that was taken by when you mentioned about Harry Potter and children and games, and trying to find ways of dealing with complexity, but at the same time making it every day in the ways that it becomes something that's much more, you know, personal rather than something that's generalizable. So I thought your presentation relative to Angelica's was very different, but at the same time was a provocation in different ways. Like Angelica's presentation, in some sense, is taking BIM as a kind of framework, and the presentation almost with the AI overview and all of these things also put together maybe like a new form agenda, maybe in the ways that they're thinking about education. That maybe Angelica, you could speak to that as someone who's
Yeah,
structuring framework for education.
I think one of the key things that was said here, to make how can we make more digestible, you know, because we are talking about an undergraduate course, so it's not a master's, it's not a doctor PhDs, but it's like the basis of the education. It's like a foundational course, and even the other colleagues, professors, they have this difficulty to understand and to cope with it. And how can we teach and or put this on the curriculum without being like just, this is an architecture course, not an engineering course. How can it make it more interesting? And one of the first things that we did was like a pilot, was Victor's master thesis, one which we were using them to teach construction technology, a construction method, not just putting it there like out of nothing. And so we also try sometimes to use design thinking resources to catch their attention, but a way that it makes more like smooth the transition, because we need to train. Ours is a very technical course, and they need to fulfill certain capabilities in order to get the registers, because when they finish, they are registered architects. So it's different than in the UK and the US. So they need to do this kind of path, and we have this amount of courses. And how can we benefit from that? And even like we use ArchiCAD, and we have like BMax, where we can use the Google glasses, and you can interact more with it. So it kind of open up new things that we can do. We're trying to show how it could be done on a little by little on like a parallel courses that could instigate certain disciplines or professors or even the students to engage with it and maybe take to another step, further step.
Well, thank you for that. Maybe Sylvan, you can speak to some of these paradoxes in your presentation. You were somehow speaking to the conversation in the corridor like almost the illicit conversation, and at the same time using digital tools. I'm curious in your research as well. I think trying to bring people together, like if it's for more traditional education or if it's in terms of kind of leveraging, different sort of social awareness and communication, or constructing a scene like an art scene, I think has all kinds of paradoxical issues. I was just kind of curious between the digital footprint, much more using digital technologies, which are in some sense highly surveilled, with this also interest that you were having of the social, political, almost as a kind of resistance in some ways to some of the issues around communication and expression and the challenges I think that are happening in all forms of society. I know that you have, I think, probably a much more direct association with some of the scenes that you were talking about in Istanbul and so forth. But from your perspective, I'm curious because the tools are obviously both creating opportunities and also creating challenges to overcome. Maybe you could speak to that relative to what I was suggesting is part of the kind of cultural milieu of today.
Think,
Not like a trick question from my side, and it's not a critique. It's a question of how one somehow sees, all of these different forces shaping things. It's clear that tools are not just mere tools. They really do structure an engaged and deep opportunity to think differently. And I think all of you guys are trying to speak to that in different ways, from short form education to structuring, departments, to actually creating in your project something that both you're exploring, but at the same time finding opportunities that other people could potentially use, this kind of framework and workflows and the things that you're talking about as well. I don't know if you could speak to that a bit.
I'll try.
Of course.
I think the purpose I was trying to do somehow was it comes from a spatial understanding of space, I would say, because I always wanted to touch the things I have in my mind, and I mean that digital overlay could somehow allow, my opinion, more people to engage with designs. It's the talk was on freedom, but it's also the freedom maybe to understand something, because I come up from a very spatial understanding of life. I danced all my life, and all my understanding is through movement. And I said, if everything that we imagine can be somehow touched, then it becomes a new opportunity for people to understand or to see or to judge, rather than 2D, something that is around us. And I mean, the technologies I engage with were opening this dimension of digital worlds being around us rather than in front of us, just in a screen. And but that is very different, I think, based on the context you put it, because some people might engage it in a good way, or other people use it in a not a very useful way. But I think the core is the way people would see, like the opportunity people would see in spaces or architecture that is more, I know you can touch it somehow. You don't touch it, but you feel you could touch it, rather than, yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that obviously is important, and the point that you made that technologies doesn't have a bias in terms of how people use them, I think is also important. So I think what's interesting for me is how projects actually give us opportunities to look at those technologies anew, right? So those technologies by themselves maybe are not as passive as we think, but the opportunities, I think, in terms of engaging it in the way that you're talking about, in terms of expression, in terms of dance, they have a kind of friction in terms of how we make that accessible. Technologies usually have very high learning curves. And I think some of the technologies you're utilizing are also something now that are becoming very pervasive. My cell phone can be a scanning tool, can be a way of documenting and spatializing kind of ways of thinking and doing, which maybe means something totally different today than it did 10 years ago. And so somehow giving legibility to that or communicating that through your work and stuff like that seems like an opportunity to make that even more accessible to people. I think technology usually is a barrier because its complexity is so on the surface that it feels like it's not accessible. So I think Angelica was making the point of trying to make something a little bit more understood, something more accessible. At the same time, I think all of you are dealing with hard problems, difficult challenges, things that are actually not easy to simplify. So there's probably a reason, Jessica, why you don't have TikTok, because maybe trying to get a lot of that work in a meaningful snapshot of like 10 seconds or 8 seconds or whatever is an appropriate TikTok video maybe doesn't actually speak to the complexity of some of the challenges that design engineering may have. It may give you like a portal almost to that world in terms of communicating it to various audiences, but how that's synthesized maybe is not really legible in that format. And I think these are challenges that we all face, but I was curious, the other side of design computation is the technical. And by taking this approach, which is more cultural, do you see any resistance in the communities that you are working with? Because it seems to me like we're living in an era of over specialization and quite clear territory. And especially in some of the institutions or the companies, an over stratification. But some of these technologies actually challenges that orthodoxy, And I'm just curious if there are forms of resistance in a meaningful way, potentially, in terms of conversation and so forth, that are emerging in the ways that you guys are approaching the subjects. Is somebody challenging the use of fantasy, let's say, in the context of engineering? Is somebody looking at the subject of, BIM strategies, which, is usually much more explicit forms of computation and control versus maybe other methodologies? And is that something that you guys see as something productive in your own practices?
I've been trying to use some AI, generative AI, with my Grasshopper students. So we're trying to use it to open up creativity or make them to go to different ways. And also just at the beginning of generation, and then or maybe a reverse way after they generate something, can they build it, start building it on 3D and go back and forth and maybe if it does work, how can it connect it to BIM and then be built, all the phases. We're trying to get some breakthroughs, but it's hard because you need to have the structure, the basis of the understanding of all these things, and then we start breaking it, and challenging them. So maybe this by little we can do little changes, but we need this foundation first, but very well planned and anchored. So, but we can do together. But there maybe I think they can work at the same time. So we don't have to finish one to start the other, but we try to be breaking the tradition, and we have a very, very traditional and modernist in our school. We have a lot of different things, not only the technical parts, but also the cultural parts. So how do you break this? How do you read this on a different way? And how do you value it on a different way? So use these tools to that as well. So maybe one of the when we are analyzing the whole curriculum, one of history was one of the subjects that we thought they could be used, of course, with virtual reality, augmented reality, and people have been using this on, if you go to Rome or museums, they give a glass and a Google Glass, and then you sit and then you start looking at and seeing things already. So how do you make this as part of a design process? How do you make the students, like, even I was talking about BMX, when they first put their projects on BIM, they can already walk on it with the glasses, so they can redesign it again and again. So how do you use it not only for bureaucratic things, but also to design with it, right? So yeah.
Yes, Angelica, if I'm not mistaken, you're also involved with the Digital Futures Initiative.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm just curious if, listening to your presentation and listening to your response to AI and some of the interest that you have in that. Because I think the structure of education is also something that doesn't necessarily have a educational model that is at the forefront. It seems like they're more self-organized communication, community, almost like open source strategies that are influencing the way that we start to think about these things much more in an accessible way. And then we have the traditional universities that are working through very rigid models. Both of them, have their obviously clear advantages in some ways, but at the moment it seems like an important opportunity to rethink a lot of things, but to do that in a meaningful way. And I'm just I only bring it up because it seems like some of those interests in digital futures and so forth came out of a need and a moment of crisis. A lot of the virtual communications, even this conference, having a virtual format is a way of somehow challenging the more traditional, everybody in a room in a lecture hall kind of format, making things more conversational, and that became something very important, particularly during the COVID crisis. But now we're sort of coming out of all of that. And then the questions are like, has that actually impacted the way that we go back to also the more traditional university formats in a meaningful way? Or are there opportunities to be considered beyond just like virtual learning? Is there something more structural that is somehow being foregrounded potentially? I bring it up just as something that you're involved in. That's why I asked.
Yeah. One thing that happened with me after COVID, I teach all. I'm one of the only ones that teach all on the design and the computer lab. We don't print. I use Miro to write it, so I sketch it. So it's all virtual. So, but then I ended up being very comfortable with it. So yeah, but I think the answer now is like hybrid. We mix things. We can have both, and can have people participating in class from somewhere else, and then we have all. I think it's important to still to see people and to touch things, and to the real conversations. But I think the virtual open up for so many things and approach people that were so far away, and especially digital features, because of people. The idea was to let education to people that couldn't afford it. Like not everybody can afford to go to an AA or to use to the Bartlett. So how do you bring those kind of insights and on how the sparks? I have students that have sparks on things, and they come to look for me to guide them how to. I just talked to my student last week about a scholarship, so she can go to London and she can study. So, but this little thing that if you can spark on them, I mean, that's I think it's worth it, And this is what things like this conference and digital futures, and we can reach out much further with the students and open up new things, new questionings as well.
And that's why we've always streamed all of our final reviews and things like that in the DRL. It was something for me that's very important to do from the beginning, which was make as accessible everything. Just turn on the camera, it'll stream for 8 hours. And there's an audience for that. I mean, if things are available, then people have the opportunity to understand much deeper. There's no marketing, there's no nothing. It's an issue of just making accessible those things, and it has an impact.
Yes.
For sure. And I think, you know, what all of you are invested in some way is part of that, you know, part of the culture of that, which I think is important. If there's something to come out of this session, it seems like to speak to that is an important part of how you guys are working on it. I mean, in Sylvan's presentation, it's interesting. He speaks so much about the physical and the experience, and you know, his own take on that, and at the same time, very invested in the digital. So this hybridity is very much part of our everyday. But what we mean by that is, I think, something that's still, you know, in the process of being formalized. I like this opportunity right now that we have, because things are very accessible, but actually we may mean something radically different. And this is where language, in some sense, limits us. So I think finding ways to make it more experiential, spatial, I think, are opportunities to invest in maybe different questions, especially around a lot of these technologies. So I think, Jessica, when you're speaking about fantasy and you're speaking about, you know, illustrative, almost like cinematic, you know, imaginative sequences and things like that. I mean, I went to a technical school. I had my share of engineering courses. I'm sure that that's opening up, you know, the possibilities to think about what people are doing differently. And to do that in a way where that is impactful and can challenge somebody, I think is very important. So I imagine the workshops that you lead are also always information. You know, you're getting feedback from people, and you're, you know, in some sense, prototyping how that is not only delivered, but, you know, is operationalized by people in kind of untraditional ways. I don't know if there's any maybe closing.
Yeah, I have maybe it's an observation or something I felt with all presentations in this session. So when Jessica said that her sister created the illustrations, and then there's that very engaging beginning of the narrative and so on. You know, when you're doing like creative writing, they say the first page, the hook, you know, that and that becomes an invitation to treat. And the fact that, you know, some other human being creates something for you, and you have that rapport, that connection with another human being. Because Jessica could have created the book using Midjourney illustrations, you know, AI illustrations, but that would not be the same. So is the social stigma context negotiation I find fascinating. How there is a social stigma. Like she gave an example that girls are not engineers, and a toy popped up from somewhere, and that trigger some sort of a context negotiation. Say, okay, this is stigma does not need to happen. And the fact that you create that rapport and that and the so-called first page hook, I think this is incredibly powerful, and I'm not quite sure why, because my niece she is on her second year psychology back in Brazil, and then I said, you have to learn English, please learn English, because this is going to open so many opportunities. And the way I managed to convince her was to say, okay, you will come over, but you're not going to stay in London with me. You're going to go to Edinburgh, because Harry Potter is there. Pretty much, you know, the right of Harry Potter is that the city is a Harry Potter fairy tale in itself, and the architecture is magnificent and so on. And she said, yeah, I'll be there next month. And that storytelling, it's so compelling, it's so powerful. And I just wonder if you have any final words on how you've articulated this social stigma context negotiation.
Is that aimed at me? Um, I'm not entirely sure if I understand correctly the social stigma context negotiation. I think I will say that, and it comes back to something Theodore said about, do you have resistance with the fantasy theme? People are so shocked to see fantasy elements in an engineering environment.
It's a huge contrast.
Yeah, that they stop and listen. And so even if their first instinct, they stop and listen, and maybe their response is to go, oh no, I don't like that. Maybe their response is to go, oh, that sounds amazing. They've listened, and it's that hook, and it's drawing people in. I think we are storytellers. That's innate in human culture. So that element does pull people in, even if they're not sure that they're comfortable with it, because that's what we do. We used to sit around fires and share stories, and that's how we shared our history. And I think, yeah, so it shocks people. I will say I always have at least one person on a course who has been made to be there and is not comfortable with the fantasy scenario. And by the end of the course, people will actively come up to me and say, I really hated this on day one, and now I have to admit, somebody said I have to admit I was wrong, and this is fantastic. So I think there's also, you just have to give time and a safe environment for people to let go of that stigma themselves, like, oh, I'm an engineer, or I'm a professional, I shouldn't be in this playful environment. I just try and create a safe learning space. A psychological safe space. We do talk about technical stuff. It's not like we're playing and we're ignoring the technical. It's like, no, we are using this as a tool. And I think it's, yeah, so, you pull people in, and even if people are not convinced in the first bit, it's the time, and it's making people feel comfortable, and it's realizing for them, again, something like they have to have a personal connection with it. It's like, oh, this has been created so I have a good time, so I learn, because people want me to be able to go in and be able to do this stuff. And it's that welcoming and warmth that I think overcomes the stigma that people are carrying around about, oh, this is too childish for me, or this is too this for me, is they go, actually, I feel comfortable. Doesn't matter what the stigma says, doesn't matter what other people have said. This is for me, and I feel comfortable, and this is helping me.
You make them believe they can.
Yeah, for sure. I hope that answered your question.
You did, yeah.
Okay, good.
Okay, so we can see that Harry Potter has many different uses.
So we need more good stories, I believe.
We do need more good stories. I will say Harry Potter, but the training course was it was based a lot on Lord of the Rings. So like all fantasy environments, and yeah.
Yes. Angelica, any final thoughts? Because this is also very contrasting for you, I believe.
Well, what, Harry Potter?
No, the fact that as Theo discussed, you creating something that is a lot bigger, and creating a framework for a 5 years course, etc. And the BIM subject is a big subject. There is the technology side of it, and there is the technical management side of it. I just wonder, in terms of social stigma and the context of that social stigma, if that was hard to negotiate, or it is an ongoing process. I just want to understand. And you did discuss this already.
It's hard. It's hard because first there are a lot of resistance from the faculty on using this, and because
there's a lot of resistance here as well at UCL.
And and also heard when I was at UCL that BIM is just for engineers. So, and I'm pretty sure that I believe that you need to know how to use those tools, because your design process can change. So the difference that when you use it, or if you sit next to somebody that is using it, you just tell them what to do. Because I'm from the ages of I graduated without technical tools, just sketching, drawing, and ink, and to transition to the digital. And now this is another big transition that is still going on, and people have a lot of resistance, even students. So the way that we try to cope with it is just working on a parallel universe. Like you have the curriculum here, and then we created this parallel course and actions and things. So to this parallel world, you can feed the core thing until you can change it. So like until they are integrated. So this is the big thing that we did different from the other game cells in Brazil. Like we are doing on a, it's structurally is interesting because you can it's like a virus. You can populate this by injecting things where you see you can need it, or offering things, seeing where it could be used, and people don't even know that they can use it. So listen, you can use this to give your this kind of class is going to help you a lot, and help the students. They're going to learn more. So how do you turn the tool into something useful? Not just because most of the faculty thinks that, oh, you need to know all about construction in order to use it. No, but how do you can learn construction by using it? We reverse the thing, and then you start making things, framework, and a kind of a new way to see things, by changing the perspective. I think that's how you break it. I think that's our contribution. Yes.